One of the most common ways that people think that individuals interact with the state and give the state some sort of authority is by something called a social contract, which is literally a contract between everybody involved in a society that says, this is what we agree that the state can do, and this is what we agree that the state can do, and this is how we agree that the state can set laws, or which laws and rights and so on and so forth the state has to respect. The thing about the social contract is that people will only agree to the social contract if they think that doing so is in their individual best interest. But you might wonder how everybody can think that a particular contract is in their best interest if we live in a liberal society where everybody has different views of what will make them happy or what will lead to a fulfilling life. The 20th century philosopher John Rawls had a really interesting answer to this question by imagining a hypothetical state of nature called the original position. In this original position, everybody was behind what Rawls called a veil of ignorance. And in this veil of ignorance, no one knew anything about themselves. All that anybody knew was that you are a member of a society and that you have goals. And that's all that you know. You don't know your age, your race, your religious beliefs, your sexual preferences, your economic status, your social standing, anything like that. Because Rawls thinks that if you did know those things, you would try to game the social contract in your favor. You might try to make it so that members of your race don't have to pay taxes, or members of your religion get to vote twice in elections, or something like that. And that's just fundamentally unfair. Now, you might ask yourself, though, if all that I know about myself is that I'm a member of a society and I have goals, are we even going to be able to agree on anything? And Rawls actually thinks the answer to this question is yes. He thinks that we're ultimately going to be able to agree on two different rules. The first rule Rawls calls the equality principle. The equality principle says that everyone has access to the same set of basic rights and freedoms, and that set of rights and freedoms should be as big as possible. The second rule that he thinks that we'll agree to is what's called the difference principle. The difference principle says that we're allowed to have social and economic differences among members. We can have people who are held in higher regard, or people who make more money, or people who are richer, as long as two things happen. Number one, these differences have to in some way make everyone better off. And number two, these differences have to be attached to jobs or positions that theoretically everyone has access to. So, for example, you might notice that in a particular society like ours, doctors are held in very high social standing. You might also notice that generally speaking, they make a lot of money. And it turns out that Rawls would be totally okay with this in his hypothetical world. He would be totally okay with this because it turns out that generally speaking, having doctors makes society better off for everybody. And if the only way that we can convince people to go through years and years of medical school is to give them extra money, or to make sure that society treats them better than the average person, then Rawls is going to be okay with that. Again, as long as everyone can actually have the opportunity to become a doctor if they would like. By the same token, you might notice that there are less prestigious jobs that nonetheless do have variations in pay in our society. For example, you can make a little bit of money working at Target. You can get a job right now at Target starting at about $15 an hour. That's pretty good. But if you're willing to do the work and be a garbage collector, you can actually make more money than you can working at Target. And again, Rawls is going to say, this is totally okay. It's totally acceptable, because if we think about a world in which we have garbage collection, that's a much better world for everyone. Not just the rich, not just the garbage collectors. We will all do better if we have a centralized system that will take care of the garbage for us. And if that requires paying garbage collectors a little bit more than paying people who work at Target, then that's totally okay. Now, you might ask yourself, what would a society like this actually look like? And Rawls would say something like this. It's going to look in sort of very, very broad outlines, a lot like what American society looks like today, or what Western democracies look like today. But there are going to be some probably pretty major changes, especially with respect to things related to this difference principle. There's a lot of things in our society where we allow for economic and social distance, but not in ways that are able to be open to everybody or make all of society better off. And so those are things that Rawls is going to say we need to fix in order to have a fully just society. Rawls is going to say one other thing with respect to these two principles. He's going to say that, maybe we could make society better off if we would infringe on some people's rights, but that's not allowed. When you're given a choice between satisfying the difference principle, making the world better off by allowing for some sort of like social or economic differences, or satisfying the equality principle, making sure that everybody has equal rights or as many equal rights as possible, Rawls is going to say you always have to pick the equality principle. The equality principle is more important than the difference principle. So you can never, ever do anything that will make society better off from a social or economic standpoint if it involves violating people's rights. Now, you might ask yourself, that sounds like a really nice theory. What exactly should we be concerned about when it comes to Rawls's theory of liberal democracy? And there are two things that you might want to think about. First, Rawls's state of nature is theoretical. And as I've talked about in some other videos, if you're going to have a theoretical state of nature, that does lead to a sort of really important question. I can tell you in a theoretical state of nature how a state might theoretically be justified, but how exactly did we get to our actual society? And how can we say that our actual society is justified? Rawls is going to say something like, well, it turns out that the same sorts of principles that someone would agree to in the state of nature are the kinds of principles that look, more or less like the principles that we used when we set up, for example, American democracy, but that's really not as clear or straightforward an argument as perhaps you might think at first blush. The second concern you might have is whether people are risk averse in the way that Rawls thinks about. So remember this, Rawls thinks that the social contract is the thing that literally every single person is going to agree to. And not only that, they're only going to agree to it if they believe that the contract is in their best interest. And so that means that you're going to come up with some very, very conservative principles. You're going to say that the difference principle, for example, will only allow difference if it literally makes everyone better off. But maybe we're willing to take a little risk. Maybe we're willing to say something like, well, I can settle for a society that will make 90% of the people much, much better off and 10% of the people actually worse off. Because I'm willing to take the risk that I'm going to be in the 90%. I think that payoff is worth it to risk being in the bottom 10%. So Rawls does have a little bit of work to do here. Interestingly, at the same time Rawls was developing his theory, there was another philosopher named Robert Nozick who was developing a competing theory at the same time that wasn't based on the idea of the social contract. It was instead based on the idea of how we can justify how we get and how we keep and how we maintain all of our property. Will that answer some of the questions that Rawls has to answer? Will that solve some of the problems that maybe Rawls faces? We'll find out in another video.